All right. And so as you were just sharing about your siblings, if you have siblings, you know growing up with siblings can be super fun, devastating, unique, lots of different things. I was listening to a podcast this past week, and the interview was with a guy by the name of Tommy Farley, who is the older brother of Chris Farley, if you remember him. And if you don't know who Chris Farley is, you can go live in a van down by the river. And so if you don't get that joke, then you're just done today. And so just give up on that. But it was amazing hearing Tommy's perspective about growing up with Chris Farley. Imagine being Chris Farley, who's quite possibly one of the funniest people to ever walk this planet, being your little brother, and just hearing the stories he was sharing and things like that. And it was amazing to hear the insight of what it was like having Chris Farley as your brother. And so growing up with siblings can be really unique. And I grew up with two younger brothers, and we tortured each other all the time. My brother Austin, who's here right now, we picked on him all the time. My brother Chad and I, who's the middle one of us three, we wouldn't just pick on each other. We would physically beat the tar out of one another, because that's how we just showed that we loved each other. Our love language was punching each other in the face. And so we had things like that. I see it now with my sons, Noah, Drew, and Kobe. They are brothers, and they love that they're brothers, but they actually torture each other. We were having our pre-service prayer with our team this morning, and I was just about to pray, and all of a sudden I see Kobe running away, and Drew, the middle kid, just open hand slaps Kobe across the face. And I'm like, he just slapped him. And Danielle was like, who? I'm like, Drew. And then, Mama Bear took in charge, and like Drew, was somewhere else after that, timeout, whatever. But it's crazy seeing how siblings operate. One of my favorite sibling situations, though, is actually my wife Danielle and her three younger brothers. If you met my wife Danielle, you love her, because there's no one who meets her and doesn't go, I like that. She's awesome. But she's not the sweet, innocent person you would think she might be. In fact, when she was younger, she was a horrible older sister. She tortured her brothers. There are stories that I've heard about of her locking them in the barn at their house. And her parents had no idea where they were. And Danielle's like, I don't know where they're at. And they were locked in a barn. One time, Danielle convinced the two older brothers, Ben and John, to go rub jalapeno peppers on their littlest brother Corey's lips while he was sleeping. So imagine that, Corey waking up to that. He's here right now too, like reminiscing and being, PTSD and things like that, a lot of crazy stuff. But he woke up just screaming because his mouth is on fire because Danielle convinced him to rub jalapeno peppers on it. But maybe the worst thing of all that Danielle used to do is she told her brothers about this thing called the mystery man. And what the mystery man was this thing: if you fell asleep with your hand under the pillow, the mystery man would come and cut off your fingers. Imagine the trauma for a little kid, like, I can't, what if I fall asleep with my hand under the pillow, but fingers are gonna be gone? This is the stuff that Danielle would do. But thankfully they grew up, my brothers grew up, hopefully Noah, Drew, and Kobe, they grew up becoming really good friends, loving spending time together. Me and my brothers now, we don't pick on each other, we take all of our attention and we put it directly towards our mom. Like, we just torture her to no end, and I feel bad for her. But this is what happens with siblings. When we're younger, we beat each other up, we have fun, we torture each other, and hopefully we grow up and grow into solid relationships. And if you have siblings, you know this too. Living and growing up together can get stressful. When you're around each other so often, you will get annoyed with each other. That's what marriage is all about sometimes. Anytime you're around someone that much, you get annoyed with each other, especially when personalities are different with siblings. Like, anyone had the sibling who was like the perfect golden child, like everything was perfect? Yeah, the ones who raise their hand are like this, like, yep, I know who they are. And other ones who aren't raising their hand, it was probably you. And you're like, I wasn't perfect. I was great. I was wonderful. Actually, that was me. I was the golden child growing up. But you ask my mom, like, I was the most well-behaved, all that good stuff. Chad and Austin were, they tortured them. I'm not the favorite anymore, though, so things can change, siblings. The golden child can be pushed aside, and you can take over the mantle of favorite child. But one child is the golden child, one child's the troublemaker, one child maybe is more rebellious, or one sibling is the goody two-shoe. But in all of that, we deal with siblings. And it's fun, it's great, it's wonderful. And we talk about, imagine being Chris Farley's sibling or dealing with our own siblings, but imagine this. What would it be like to be the sibling of Jesus? Like, think about that. Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the Savior, the whole thing, this whole one church thing is centered on. Imagine being the sibling of Jesus. I mean, talk about having the perfect sibling, right? The perfect sibling who doesn't do anything wrong, performs miracles, creates a big following. You know, he's God in the flesh. Like, just crazy things could happen with your brother being Jesus. And over the next 5 weeks, we are starting a brand new series that we're calling Dear Church, James. And what that means is we're looking at what the book of James says in the Bible, in the New Testament, because he wrote this book towards the new early church and how it still impacts the church today. And we're looking at this because James is actually the half-brother of Jesus. And each summer we look at a New Testament book together. Last summer we did Philippians, this summer we're doing James, to see a unique perspective of how the church was operating back then, but also how it impacts us today now. And this summer we get this unique perspective of looking at this letter written by Jesus' half-brother, James. And a little bit of background about James is that Jesus had many half-siblings. This is something we don't maybe know sometimes. We don't get taught that growing up, but Jesus had many half-siblings. Mary and Joseph, Jesus' stepfather technically, had children together after Jesus was born, and this was known in their community. And Matthew 13:55, Matthew writes this as there was a conversation going on. Someone was questioning Jesus. They go, "Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name Mary? And aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas?" And so here we see Matthew recording this conversation going on, people acknowledging that Jesus has this family. He's not an only child. He's got siblings as well, and some of their names are James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. He had multiple half-siblings. And what's crazy is, and actually not crazy, it kind of makes sense, early on, those siblings did not believe Jesus was who he claimed to be. Because the truth is, I wouldn't either. If my brother came up to me claiming to be the Messiah, I'd smack him back to humanity just for saying it. You know what I mean? Like, I get that his brothers didn't believe it. They were skeptical. I would be too. In John 7:2-5, we have this recorded. John writes, "But when the Jewish festival of the tabernacles was near, Jesus' brothers said to him, 'Leave Galilee and go to Judea, so that your disciples there may see the works you do. No one who wants to become a public figure acts in secret. Since you are doing these things, show yourself to the world.'" Verse 5, "For even his own brothers did not believe in him." They didn't understand his purpose, didn't understand his mission, and John even writes they did not believe in who he claimed to be, that he was the Messiah. They thought he was just trying to be some public figure, like a magician, street magician, to gain fame and following. They did not believe he was the Messiah. But you can not believe that all you want. If you're Jesus' siblings, growing up and he's claiming these things and doing these things, you can still be skeptical, and I understand that. But here's the difficult thing. It's hard to see your brother die and then come back to life, right? Like, even I would admit if my brothers did that, I'm like, yeah, that's pretty cool, man. Not bad. But Jesus does this, and so his brothers then, and his siblings, they have to understand that here's something more to their sibling. And so we don't know if all of them came to believe in their brother. We don't have all that recorded, but at least some of his siblings came to believe in their brother Jesus as the Savior they had been waiting for, as the Jewish people in the world had been wanting for a long time. And one of them was James, his half-brother James. And James, he didn't believe at first, but then came to believe in who his brother was. And James then became a leader in the early church in Jerusalem. And the early church in Jerusalem was made up of Messianic Jews. And what they were the Jewish people who grew up in Jewish traditions and regulations and rules and all that kind of stuff, worshiping in the temple. But what they did is they still held their Jewish roots, but they came to believe in Jesus as the Messiah they were waiting for. And so they were these Messianic Jews. That's what made up most of the Jerusalem church, and that church that James was helping to lead went through some very difficult times. There was a bad famine in the land that led to some extreme poverty. So the church that James was helping to lead and take care of, the people there were going through really bad poverty because of the famine that took place in the land. Also, there was persecution from Jewish leaders who did not believe in Jesus, and they were putting these Christians to death, putting them in jail. And so they're not just dealing with poverty, they're dealing with persecution that's causing them to fear for their lives. It's causing them to flee away from Jerusalem because they're trying to save their own lives because of their faith in Jesus. And so this is the situation the church is dealing with that James was helping to lead. And so what James does then is he sees his church being scattered away, moving away to save their own lives, to get to a better place. He decides to write a letter to all of them who are scattered to different spots. And in this short letter that he writes some extremely powerful things. He doesn't teach anything new necessarily. He's not saying, hey, here's this new thing to believe when it comes to following Jesus. He says, listen, everything you've learned and know, we've got to do that now. And he's encouraging them in this difficult time. He says, go out and live what you know. And here's the truth. As we go through this series together, I'm going to warn you guys, James can be a gut punch in certain situations. Some of our small groups have gone through this study, and it just leaves us speechless sometimes because James does not hold back. In fact, when I was a teenager, I was struggling with the idea of faith. I had grown up in the church, was doing the religious thing, going to church every Sunday, checking my boxes, all that kind of stuff, but I felt very stale. It felt like it wasn't worth it. And I talked to my youth pastor one night, and all he did with me, he didn't give me deep counsel or anything like that. He just said, go home and read James tonight. And I was like, but you don't understand. He's like, just go home and read James tonight. And it was still one of the most powerful moments in my faith. I started reading the book of James and seeing what he wrote, knowing his background as Jesus' half-brother, and came away revitalized, knowing that my faith was not something that I was just doing in vain. And hopefully this does the same thing for us. And so what's going to happen is, this letter that he writes, it's a summary for kind of all followers of Jesus of how we should live our lives. And it hits on a lot of topics. James just hits on a bunch of different things that people are going through. Then it's also going to be relevant today. And so the problem is that there's so many topics that's going to hit through this series. We don't have time to cover all of them on Sunday mornings, or else you get really annoyed sitting in a hot auditorium for that long. And so here's what we're going to do with this. As we cover kind of one chapter a week, there's also reading plans available at the information table. So I'm going to encourage you guys, before you leave today, grab one of those bookmark-looking things that has the reading plan on it. It's going to challenge you to read through the book of James consistently throughout the next 5 weeks. And so those are available. And then on our Facebook page every Wednesday, we're going to release a quick video that kind of digs in more of that week's chapter. And so if you don't like our Facebook page at One Church Pittsburgh, look that up, like it, follow us. And so on Wednesdays, we'll be releasing some more content as we're walking through this series, Dear Church, the book of James. And so we dig in today as we hit off chapter 1. Okay, that's a good place to start, right? And what James does is he hits on a bunch of topics really quickly. That in chapter 1 of James, it kind of sets up the rest of the letter that he's writing to, remember, these scattered Christians who are scattered because of their poverty and the persecution that is going on. And here he says, he greets all the scattered Christians, and he says in verse 2, James 1:2, he says this right away: consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. So think about this. He's writing to these scattered Christians, and James goes, hey everybody, it's me, it's James. Hey, here's the deal. Consider it joy that you're going through all these really difficult times right now, like this persecution, the poverty. You should be joyful about this. Now, if you receive that letter and you're going through the situation where you're running for your life because of your faith and your poverty is so bad because of this famine, I'm guessing the first thing you don't want to hear is, hey, consider this thing going on. You should be joyful about that. This is good stuff, guys. I'm serious. This is what James says, but he cuts right to the chase. He says, consider it joy when you face trials. But remember, many of them are poor. They're being persecuted. So joy, why? Why joy? Why would James, who's the half-brother of Jesus, skeptical about his brother, but now believes in his brother, say this to these Christians? You should consider it joy. Well, he continues in verse 3 and 4. Because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. James is saying it's in the test of your faith that it produces, when you trust God, this perseverance, this wherewithal, this faith, this trust to keep going no matter what takes place in life. No matter the fact that your situation in life with your financial resources are really bad because of the famine, no matter the fact that there are people that want to kill you because of your faith in Jesus, you keep persevering, because in that perseverance, it's going to continue to bless you, continue to strengthen you, and continue to bring you to a more complete faith. And what's unique is that word that gets translated the more complete faith. Another way to translate that word is actually the word perfect. Now, James wasn't saying that if you just keep persevering that you'll be this perfect person, this perfect Christian, this perfect follower of Jesus. You'll never miss a Sunday morning ever again. Nothing like that. That's not what he's getting at. What he was saying is when we become a more perfect person, a more perfect faith, he's saying a more whole faith, a more complete faith, one of integrity and consistency. Because here's the truth about the church then and about humans now today as well. We are more compromised as people than we'd like to admit. A lot of us in this room, all of us in this room, we have our own beliefs, our thoughts, our worldviews on things, and we can fight it and argue it to our dying breath. But in certain moments, in certain situations, even the worldview that we believe in, the faith that we believe in, we'll compromise that. We'll do something that kind of goes against that for our own comfort, our own pressure, or whatever it may be. Sometimes our actions don't back up what we actually believe. For instance, I think all of us here would agree that when Jesus said it's good to love your neighbor as yourself, it's one of the two greatest commandments he's given, we would agree with that. And we would say, yeah, we should love people. We should be kind to people, except for that jerk down the hall at my office. Or accept the neighbor who doesn't cut their grass enough, or whatever it may be. There's reasons that we compromise our own viewpoints on life because it's more comfortable that way. Or there's pressure there, there's convenience there. Rather than trusting in what God says, we compromise. And so what James is saying here is in situations in life when we persevere, our faith becomes more complete, more integrity comes out of it. James writes that we should be joyful about our difficult points in life because it's in that when we trust God that it will turn to perseverance that will make our faith more whole. We'll compromise less and less and we'll trust God more and more. So he starts off his letter this way, like it's just pretty in your face right away. And then he continues right after that by saying, okay, you should be joyful. You should, this is going to produce perseverance, but this is difficult. I get that. He's kind of giving some kindness here. He says, well, here's how you get this actual perseverance. He says this in 5-8. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. When you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. So this is what I love about James. He starts off like really nice again in this first couple of verses here. Like, hey, if you lack it, if you're struggling with it, if you're wanting to know how you really trust God through difficult times, just ask God for that wisdom. Ask him. He's going to give it to you. God gives it generously. This is the God that we serve. He's not a God who withholds gift or wisdom or faith. If you ask for it, he's going to give you this ability to persevere no matter how difficult life gets. Okay, that's a nice thing James says, right? Then he says, but don't doubt. Don't doubt, because then you're like a wave in the sea. You get thrown back and forth. You got to be, believe when you ask for it, because you know what? If you do that, you're a double-minded person and unstable in all you do. Like, think about that. Hey, ask God for wisdom. That's great. But if you doubt, you're just kind of a waste of space. You're unstable in all you do. You're being blown back and forth. Don't be that way, which is really intense for James to say. He says, in your testing, if you don't know what to do, ask God. He gives that wisdom generously. This is how you're going to persevere. You're going to trust. But it comes with that warning to believe and don't doubt. Now listen. James says don't doubt in this situation, but here's the truth in our lives and our experiences. Doubt creeps in. Doubt about our faith in God, doubt about that God's there with us or for us and with, all those different things. Doubt will creep into our faith. It's normal, it's natural. The thing though with doubt is, are we willing to, in the midst of our doubt, even though we don't know the outcome, even though we can't see ahead of us in that doubt, do we still trust that God is there and that God is working? Because here's the deal, the early church that he's writing to, there's a lot of doubt there. Doubt where their next meal's coming. Doubt where they're going to live and sleep because their lives are on the line. That stuff can easily creep in. But what James is saying is, hey, ask God for the wisdom to persevere in the midst of all of this. Because it's going to lead to a more complete faith in the midst of everything going on. Doubt's going to creep in. The question is, are we going to trust in the midst of that doubt that God's truthfulness, his faithfulness, his love is greater than the doubt that can creep into our lives no matter what happens? We need to ask God for that help and trust that he will give it. And so James kind of just sets up his letter, just kind of throwing haymakers necessarily. Consider it joy when life sucks. Deal with it because it's in that your faith's going to get better. It's going to be great. Ask God for wisdom, but don't doubt. And so he just comes out swinging in this letter. And then right after that, he addresses the poor. He addresses the poor and says that there should be pride in their current state of being poor. Again, that sounds crazy, and especially sounds crazy as we sit here in our American culture right now, because no one goes, hey, you should definitely be proud about being poor in America. Like, no one celebrates that. That's not something we aspire to. We still believe if you're poor, something bad happened to you and you can't recover in life. And so we think that in our culture, and James, they see it in their culture too, and he says, nuh-uh, take pride in that. because, remember that original audience is dealing with extreme poverty. He says the answer to their problems they're dealing with right now is not wealth. That's not going to solve the problem. That's not the issue, because here's the deal. He said that wealth is going to fade anyway. That's not going to be the thing that sustains them or gives them this complete faith in life that only Jesus can. What he's saying is the main idea is faith through perseverance, because then he says in verse 12, blessed is the one who perseveres under trial. Having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. And James is saying this as he's getting this letter going. He says, when you persevere, you're strengthened. You are blessed. Your life becomes stronger because of that. And there is something better waiting for us in the end of all this. So persevere, because there's something much better we can hope for and cling to in this life that we live now and what God promises in the end. And what's amazing here is he says at the end, this is what the Lord has promised to those who love him. So much of what James is calling them to do is not rooted in religious regulations. It's not rooted in just duty, you should do this because that's the box you could check. It's rooted directly in our love of God. It's rooted directly in that relationship. Jesus taught in his ministry, and James is kind of beckoning, recalling this. He says, Jesus' two greatest commandments are to love God with everything you have and love people. Love your neighbor as yourself. And this is going to be a constant theme throughout James's letter, reminding us of what Jesus is calling us to love God and love people. And he's saying it's our love of God that leads us to persevere, because we trust that what he will do is better than any other outcome that we're dealing with in life currently. It's rooted in that love. So to kind of summarize as it gets started, James says life is tough. But in that, we're to trust God because God is better than our fleeting circumstances here on this earth, even poverty and persecution, which what the original audience was going through. Trust God above all to become more like him. And so he kind of leaves us out there. This is what you're supposed to do. This is what I'm calling you to remind you to do. But then he kind of just says, you can't just listen to this, though. You have to do it. It's one thing to read what James said and what James taught and what God called for. And we can say we believe it, but if we actually believe it, don't we actually have to do it then? And this is what he starts getting to with his audience. There has to be action. He says a few verses later in verses 22 and 25 in chapter 1, he says, do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in the mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what they have heard but doing it, they will be blessed in what they do. See, a common theme that James hits on consistently throughout his letter is that faith without action really isn't faith at all. It's like saying, I believe in Jesus, I'm following Jesus, but my life doesn't look like I'm following Jesus. If that's the case, us saying we follow Jesus means nothing. Action has to be coming after the faith we profess. We can say we believe anything we want, but if our lives don't back that up, it's simply empty words. And James teaches that we are strengthened in our faith if we do what our faith calls us to do. Without it, it's like looking in the mirror and walking away and forgetting what we look like. It's a waste of time, it's a waste of effort, a waste of energy. And so James comes out firing in this letter. He's saying it's not about an easy life, but a life of faith. And it's not going to happen if we just ignore what we've been taught. And so James starts his letter by getting very blunt and to the point. And remember, he's speaking to new Christians who are going through difficult situations. He almost seems like he's insensitive in this moment. And we'll read throughout the rest of this series. He seems like he's insensitive a lot of the moments in his letter. But that's not what he's doing. That's not what he's getting at. He's actually being extremely helpful to help the Christians who are being persecuted, and hopefully us today too, to see a bigger picture and a better picture of what following Jesus is all about. James' honesty and bluntness are something we need today too. And to be clear, we're not going to go through anywhere really close to what maybe those early Christians were. I mean, yeah, some of us will go through poverty and go through difficult financial situations, but we live in a country where our faith is pretty easy to profess, and we don't have to worry about people killing us for it. There may be moments like that here and there, but we live in a very secure situation in our culture, in our city here in Pittsburgh, where you know what? It's okay to follow Jesus. People may not like that, but we can still live here. We're not going to be persecuted for it. We're not going to be forced to move out of our homes and our community. And so, yeah, we may not go exactly through what the early church did that James was writing to, but let's also be honest. life's not going to be easy. There's no one in this room that we can say that life is always easy, that life is great and grand and wonderful. People in this room will deal with marital issues, relationships ending, difficulties at jobs and raising kids. We'll deal with situations where we mourn the loss of a loved one. And those things in life, those things can hit us, and we can realize the difficulties that we face in life, it's not fun. And in those moments, our faith can get tested, we can waver, we can struggle, and in the midst of that faith crisis, it creates doubt, it creates tension, it creates fear. And sometimes what we need to hear is what James says to the early church. Consider it joy. Now, he's not saying consider it joy that a marriage is ending, or consider it joy that you've lost a loved one, or consider it joy that work is just not going well right now. You may need to be looking for another job, or you get laid off from your job or something like that. He's not saying, hey, be joyful that that happened. He's saying be joyful that in this circumstance, God is with you. God is calling you to persevere, because in that perseverance, your faith will become more complete. See, following Jesus is not about our happiness. It's not about our happiness. It's not about getting everything fixed and everything being good. It's not about getting better things in life. And sometimes we think about that with God, like, okay, God, I'm going to trust you, I'm going to follow you, but because of that, you're going to give me more wealth, you're going to give me more health, all the broken things in my life, you're going to fix them and make them better. That's what you're supposed to do, God. I believe in you, I trust you, I love you. All right, get to work, do it. And we think that sometimes. That's what we believe sometimes, but that is not what following Jesus is about. It's not about our happiness. There's actually a term for this way of thinking when it comes to God. It's called moralistic therapeutic deism. And this is what a lot of people in our country actually believe when it comes to our faith. We believe in God, but this is the concept of God we believe in. We believe, first of all, to be a good person, be that moral person, that moralistic person. Do good, be good to others. When we do that thing, God will be happy with us and things will go good. So just be a good person. That's the purpose of life. And then God, we only need him when things are going bad. So it's like if we just be a good person, take care of our own things, then things are okay. But when things are broken, things get messed up, something happens, then we need God. Then we need the therapy. God, come fix me, come save me, come, all these broken things, make it better. I need more money, I need more health, I need all these different things. And so that's what we look at God for, to be that therapeutic help to make all the bad things get better in life. So be a good person, but if things get broken, God will come fix it. And then we treat God in this deist mentality where we believe that God is there and that God exists, but he's way off in the distance. And he's out there, he doesn't really care unless we really need him, and then we'll call upon him and say, God, we need your help here. And so we believe this moralistic therapeutic deism of be a good person, God will help us when we need him, but if we don't need him, he can just stay off in the distance. And this is so much of what our faith turns into in our culture. This is not what it's supposed to be, because when we do that, we treat God like he's supposed to just make us happy in life. So often when things go bad, we think God's there to help us, and it throws us off when those bad things don't get better. We can pray all we want for a loved one to get better from a sickness, and when it doesn't happen, we can go, God, where are you at on that one? Come on. We struggle with a marriage falling apart. We go, God, why aren't you fixing this? And it doesn't get fixed, and we're just wondering, what is going on? God, where are you in this? And those bad things and those difficult circumstances in life, it can cause us to get thrown off in our faith, because often difficulties in life can move us further away from our faith. Here's a kind of a unique thing that I've seen a lot with people when it comes to faith. A lot of times, difficult things in life can pull us in closer to God. Especially when we've been far away from God, we haven't pursued our relationship with God. Sometimes it's a life tragedy or a difficulty that can make us wake up and go, oh, maybe I should explore who God is more. Maybe I should look to trust and follow Jesus more. And that's a good thing. God can use those things. We talked about that a few weeks ago when we talked about suffering, how God can use suffering to draw us back to him. The problem is that draws us back to God, but we forget that those difficulties and that life can be hard still happens even when we're following Jesus. So even though life difficulties can bring us back to God, sometimes life difficulties push us further away from God. When we're following God, we're trying to trust Jesus, we're trying to engage more with our local church and things like that, and then life still hits, it can still cause us to go, oh, maybe this isn't worth it, and you start fading away from it. This is what can happen because we think sometimes following Jesus is about our happiness. We should, though, consider our difficulties joy. Sure, we're not happy about it, but it's there we can persevere and trust, knowing that God uses it to bring us to a more complete person. So it's not about our happiness, but here's what it is about. Following Jesus is about our holiness. It's about being set apart for God's purpose. And God's purpose is for us to become more and more like Jesus. God didn't send Jesus to rescue us from difficulties, but to restore us to be more like him. Because in that's where life is found, and we are made more complete, more perfect, and more whole. When James says to let perseverance finish its work, he's saying to stay faithful and becoming more like Jesus. Not that difficulties would just go away, but it's in that you become more like Christ, and it's there we find freedom. It's there we find life. It's there we find wholeness in who God is calling us to be. He even reminded the poor to take pride in their position and that the persecution, that wasn't going away. In fact, shortly after James wrote this letter, he was killed for his faith. And he probably knew it was coming. It's in difficult times in life that we are called to trust. And in that trust, God will make us more like him. And we have to realize that following Jesus is more about trusting and becoming more like him than it is about our happiness or things getting fixed all the time. That our values then become more like his. That we value what God values. That our character is more like God's character. That we love more and more. We love God more. We love our neighbors more. It's not about our happiness, but about our holiness. And life will be hard. So let's allow God's work to take place. And so here's some practical steps I want to encourage all of us to be doing, not only just through this series together, but really for our lives as we're striving to follow Jesus. And the first is this, what James says, pray for wisdom. To persevere, not that all the bad goes away, but that through the bad, we become more faithful and more like Jesus. It's okay to pray for the things that you're wanting. If things are bad in life, for solutions to take place, it's okay to pray for that. But there's no promise those things are going away. And just because those things may not go away, it doesn't mean God's not there and God isn't faithful. But God's calling you in those times to be faithful, to trust that he has something much better for us in the end. So pray for that wisdom. So be praying for that throughout your days when life gets difficult. So pray for wisdom. Also, remember this, your circumstances do not define you. Your wealth, your job, your situation in life, it does not define you to God. God doesn't look at you and go, because you make X amount of money, you're better in my eyes. Or because of this job you have, you're better in my eyes. Because I'm a pastor, doesn't put me on an elevated platform from you guys, because we're all one people who God loves, who God sent Jesus to rescue and restore us. Those things do not define us. Jesus does. And James reminds his audience that the things we will have in life will fade. The wealth, the health, all those things, but that's not what defines us in Jesus. It's Jesus' rescue and restoration of us through his death and resurrection is what defines us. So we have to remember that no matter what happens in life, those are the things that not define us, Jesus does. And then this, don't listen to this, do it. I want to encourage all of us to get as practical as we possibly can throughout this series together. As we're reading through the book of James and going through your reading plan, when James says to do things, guess what? We should be doing those things. It's not about learning something new or filling our mind with more stuff. It's more like, okay, God, you've said this, you've worked through Jesus, you've saved us through Jesus, and now his brother, who didn't believe him, now believes in him so much, he's saying, go do this because life will be more complete that way. So go do it. It's a waste if we don't practice it. If we just listen on Sundays and don't do anything about it Monday through Saturday, we're not going to be brought to more completion. We're not going to be more whole as a church. We're not going to continue to grow in our mission as a church. We have to do it. So the one thing we have to remember is this, is following Jesus doesn't make things easy, but it makes us more like Jesus as things get hard. Life about following Jesus isn't about the easy way of doing things. It's not about our happiness. It's about even in difficult times, we become more like Christ. A teacher by the name of Francis Chan, and my small group knows Francis Chan because we went through a James study with him teaching it. And seriously, if you're not in a small group, we're kicking them off again this fall. You need to be a part of one because it's there where your faith gets beat up. At least you're with other people when Francis Chan tells you that you need to be a better Christian. It's awesome. But Francis Chan tells us stories. He's teaching through the book of James. He talks about silversmiths. And when they are melting down the silver to use it to make jewelry or whatever they need to make, what would happen is there would be impurities in it. And what would happen is when they would boil this down and get the silver hot, the impurities would kind of rise to the top. And what they would do is they would clean it out, and then they would melt it down again, and more impurities would come to the top, and they would clean it out, and they would keep doing that. They get all the junk out of the silver so they can make the best work they possibly could as silversmiths. And the tests they would do to make sure the silver was in a good spot from the actual start their work is this. they would look over top the silver and they would look for their reflection. And they could see a reflection of themselves, and the silver was ready to go. And this is the work that God does with us when life hits hard. That when we trust and we persevere, those things in our lives that get in the way of us following God and loving him and loving other people, they start working themselves out, and God starts clearing the junk out of it. And he keeps doing that. He's not going to stop doing that. So I'm going to be honest with you guys. Life is not going to get easier as we keep going on. It's still going to be hard. But it's in those moments when we trust and persevere, the impurities get taken away because God is doing his work. And eventually, as God keeps doing that, he keeps looking into us. And what we become more of a reflection of him. And that is the result of every follower of Jesus. As we continue to trust, as we continue to follow, our lives get transformed to reflect more of who God is. This is what James is getting at as we go through this together. The more we trust God in our hardships, the more we become more like Jesus. The more like Jesus we become, the better our community sees who God really is. And they need to see that God isn't about happiness, but about holiness just as much as we do. And so each week we remember that we're becoming more and more like Jesus, even in our sufferings, because God is a God who works through suffering, especially through his son, Jesus. The reason you and I can be rescued and restored is because of suffering. That Jesus, God in the flesh, came to this earth to teach, to rescue, to restore, and he laid down his life for you and me and for his siblings, the siblings who didn't believe in him at one point. And he suffered in that so that you and I can have new life and new hope. And we were reminded of that through the book of James. And so what's going to happen is I'm going to pray. We're going to pass communion. Hold on to that because we're going to worship this truth of who Jesus is together. Then we'll take that communion together to be reminded that even when life gets difficult, it's not about things getting easy, but becoming more like Christ as life gets hard. Let's pray. Father God, thank you so much for today. We thank you for this church and in this building, and it's hot and it's uncomfortable, but God, we're here, we're worshiping, we're celebrating, we're exploring more of who you are. We thank you for that. God, we thank you for Jesus, and we thank you for his brothers and James, who writes to remind the church then and still reminds us now to trust you no matter what happens. That God, you are a God that works through suffering, you work through hardships, and it's in that you make us more like who you are and who you want us to be. So we thank you for that. We're trusting you in that. And it's your name we pray. Amen.